Okay, we've been talking about Anselm on the Atonement, and we've done one part as an introduction. Now I'm going to take a deeper dive. This is going to get into actual theology, so it's going to get a little deeper to kind of pull out more from Anselm, but also to use David Bentley Hart, who is written on this in a great article, to try to help to explain why church in the West and church in the East, and then Protestants and Catholics, how they have viewed Anselm and how they viewed the Atonement, and does it really line up? And so you're going to see his arguments of how he feels that Anselm has been misread, and therefore the Atonement has been misunderstood. And again, I would encourage you to watch the first video. We're doing all of this as a prelude to our study into Greg Gilbert's book that's been translated for us, What is the Gospel? And trying to weed out and understand. And so in the two videos I did to begin that discussion, that dialogue, I mentioned that Anselm and the Atonement is misunderstood. Also, it's worth pointing out that maybe you should study Athanasius on the Incarnation, as he comes up quite a bit in the discussion as well. So it'd be worth to look at him and to study into him. The previous video was by Albrecht Ritschl from the Patristics podcast. I pretty much relied on him. Apologize for some of the material in the middle of that video because I was not feeling well when I recorded that, so I didn't have as much interaction as I wanted to. So hopefully, though, by the end, you were able to understand better how someone can read Anselm and the Atonement and understand it through a non-violent approach. And so in this video, we're going to pick it up. So again, often on the topic of the Atonement, Anselm is brought into the discussion. In this video, we look to delve into what has been said about Anselm's views on the Atonement, to discern what has been said and what may be true to his ideas, since most have not read him more fully. Many may even be unaware of his thoughts altogether. And so, as I said, we're going to turn to David Bentley Hart, who is a PhD, teaches University of Virginia, Eastern Orthodox theologian and philosopher. So, since we're in the East here, I'd like to kind of turn to some Eastern theology to help us understand. He's written a wonderful article that we're going to be going through here, called The Gift Exceeding Every Debt, an Eastern Orthodox Appreciation of Anselm's Car Deus Homo. So that comes in Pro Ecclesia, Volume 7, Number 3, in 1998. So this is the basis for this video, and Hart is a well-known and well-respected and well-versed individual whose language is quite profound, so it's going to be quite interesting. So we begin with the division between the Eastern and Western Christianity, officially almost a millennia old, effectively far older though, has often been characterized as the ineluctable effect of one or another irreconcilable and irreducible difference. And so he wants to discuss, in the context of Anselm and the Atonement, there's a division between the way the Eastern and Western Christianity see things. And so it's interesting, as we discussed before, how different scholars view Christianity. I think it was someone told me that a famous guru, and some have said maybe it was Gandhi, I don't know, from the South India, said that Christians are so divided they cannot agree on one God. They don't know who Jesus is. There's so many different denominations, where the Hindus have over 330 million gods. And so it's going to be interesting to see how different ones view Anselm and the Atonement, and then from this dialogue, maybe we can pull out in a greater understanding ourselves through the eyes of someone that's quite profound in the way he sees the Bible and the world. So this is where he begins. So we have a division between the Eastern and Western Church, officially the Latin Western Roman Catholicism, and then the Eastern Orthodox. And then, of course, we have the Protestant Reformation, where we have many different splits in the church. So, many Orthodox theologians have long believed, not entirely without warrant, that Western narratives of salvation have all too often reduced the atonement worked by Christ to the status of a simple transaction enacted more or less entirely on the cross and intended solely as an appeasement of the Father's wrath against sin. And so this seems to be a quite profound element in the Reformed tradition. This is very, very much a part of what they believe. And we already did with Alvin Rappian a review of Anselm and his atonement theology, and Alvin has pointed out how different one could view it. And if you just read Anselm casually and see the satisfaction language, then you can easily see where the Reformed position picks up on this satisfaction that God must be satisfied, and how Alvin was able to pick out something different from Anselm, because it's not a casual reading but a careful reading. And so this is the premise that David Bentley Hart wants to address, that Eastern theologians seem to see this is the way that the West believes the gospel, which is why we're here, because we're trying to understand. And so Greg Gilbert, in his definition of what is the gospel, has narrowly defined it. And what I have argued in the first two videos is that the gospel is far more glorious, far more grander, greater. It's just, I feel like that Gilbert has put the gospel in a box and limited it so much. And so this is how David Bentley Hart, as an Eastern Orthodox theologian philosopher, says that his tradition sees the message that the church from the West wants to preach as the gospel. And so he's trying to help his audience understand the West, but he's also trying to help the Western audience understand the Eastern church. So I thought this would be a wonderful deep dive into some great theology. So we go on here. Hart says, for many in the Eastern Church, it is simply a given that Western soteriology exhibits no very profound sense of the salvific significance of the resurrection or of the ontological dimension of salvation opened up in the incarnation, or the superabundance of God's mercy, which requires no tribute of blood to evoke it. Now, maybe this is difficult for you to understand because Hart speaks very much as a theologian and philosopher, but I'm hoping that the previous video is going to help you understand this. Okay, so what we did in the session 1 and session 2, when we were trying to work through a word study on evangelion and evangelizo, was try to understand that the gospel is far greater than just that one single event on the cross, okay? Not that the cross is not important. And maybe you took away from one of my comments in those two videos about it's not just the cross. I don't mean to make the cross belittle it. What I'm trying to do is say that the gospel has far more to it than just the cross. There's so much more in it. And so what Hart is saying here also is, again, if you go back to the first video, where Rappian argues for a non-violent approach to the atonement, therefore no blood is required. There's no requirement, there's no necessity, because this is an act of love, okay? So again, don't get lost. Bentley Hart goes on. Hart says, Christ is after all the conqueror of death and the devil, who joins us in the Spirit to the new creation he's established in himself in order to divinize us. Again, this is this theosis that's very strong in the Eastern Church. And it's amazing that the Nepal Church from East does not understand this. And so I'm trying to give you some Eastern Church, but this is glorification. And remember in Embodied Justice, where I point to Matthew Bates, whom we're going to get into in our opening session when we discuss Bates, McKnight, and Gilbert. But remember how I turn to Bates in Romans 8 and argue in Embodied Justice that in Romans 8, glorification, glorified, is in the past tense. And so there's this idea that we can participate in the now, in the already sense of something that's not yet. So there's some form of glorification, which I argue for in Embodied Justice, that can take place now. And that's part of the gospel, and that's part of atonement. Okay? And so Hart goes on to say, and it is this, so the story goes, that has been lost to view among the Western Via Crucis. In other words, the West, even the Roman Catholic Church, focuses so much on the cross. And that's wonderful, because the cross is such a wonderful thing to focus on. It's so profound. But if that causes us to then not see other aspects that the Eastern Church wished to highlight in the incarnation itself, which I again argue in Embodied Justice. And one scholar who read my paper said that my Embodied Justice paper was more of a patristics approach to seeing things rather than the common biblical studies approach. What Hart is trying to describe to his Eastern Orthodox brothers who read this, but he's also trying to reach across the divide into the Western Church and try to balance both to see how both view things so that we can each learn from each other. Okay? So, again, I don't want to, and neither does Hart. No one wants to belittle the cross, but that's not the only thing. I often discuss it with my students like this. It would have been easy for Jesus to show up on Tuesday afternoon and say, I'm going to die in a couple of days and then be raised, and that was it. But it was involved more. He had to become like us. He had to become human. The importance of the incarnation, the importance of the resurrection, and very much the importance of the ascension is all in what Matthew Bates and what Scot McKnight are trying to argue for in the gospel. And it's this Western view on the cross that Gilbert is guilty of that limits his approach, because he's so scared of looking outside of his box that causes him to miss this grand view that the Eastern Church offers. So, again, Hart says, this focus on the cross was this unrelenting concentration on the language of penal suffering and remission from debt. So it's this idea that Gilbert wants to focus totally on just this idea of suffering and debt. Okay, this is what is the problem. And so only because he says this is the most important thing and this is what you should see all the time, and it causes him to stumble and not see other things that Hart and the Eastern Church wants to bring to the table for Christians to enjoy. So then the question remains, what does the West, what does the church want to say the gospel is? And by saying that, do they want to say the gospel is not? And so, where is the focus? And so there are certain portions of the church, and it's wonderful that the Roman Catholicism, how they focus on the cross, the passion, they want to see Jesus and his suffering, and they want to enter into that. But that's not the only thing. Okay, that's not the only thing. And so the Eastern Church brings in something else to try to help also, that not only did Christ suffer, and this debt language that really you misunderstand when you apply the later understanding of debt, and you don't go back to what I argue in Embodied Justice for what Seneca describes as debt. You misunderstand. You need to YouTube David DeSilva on this. Okay, and he has wonderful video on, at least one or two on this. But anyway, Hart continues, and no figure in the Western tradition provides a more compelling illustration of this supposed Again, as I discussed in the first video. Supposed failing on the part of the Western Church, the Anselm of Canterbury and his Cardeus Homo, written so soon after the schism. So this is one of the first people to write one of the major things after the official split of the church, where he seems to mark the divide between the two theological climates with an exquisite historical precision. And what Hart is going to argue in this paper as we go through it, and you're going to see, is that actually Anselm is very profound, very precise, and he's arguing for a very certain thing, and most people generalize and miss it. They missed the trees for the forest, okay, and they assume what Anselm says in the Atonement, and they justify their version of the Atonement by quoting parts of Anselm without engaging his fuller argument. Hart goes on, and in speaking of Christ's death in terms of satisfaction, but what does Anselm mean by satisfaction? Okay, and that's what we need to get into. And in speaking of Christ's death in terms of satisfaction, he certainly appears to prove beyond any doubt how far Western theology had strayed by the time of the division from the high road of patristic orthodoxy. So again, Hart is coming from an Eastern Orthodox position and trying to describe how the Eastern Orthodox view Western soteriology and how they feel that it diverts from the more patristic view of what the fathers in Orthodoxy. Again, it's Eastern Orthodox Church, and they feel like that they still have a view of the fathers in mind, as opposed to what the West has done, something else. Okay, so to understand the split in the church, it's the Roman Catholic Church who left Eastern Orthodoxy, is what they seem to think. That's their view, that they are continuing on as they were. This is the same church for the past 2,000 years ago, and the Roman Catholic Church, the West, did something else. That's their view. And so Hart is speaking to his audience. Okay, but he's also going to speak to his audience to help them understand, at least Anselm, that Anselm didn't necessarily mean what the Eastern Orthodox think. And he's going to also point back to the Western Church and says, you got Anselm wrong as well. So this is what makes this discussion so interesting, because he's going to take both sides at hand for misreading Anselm. So, Hart says, I hope rather to free Anselm from some of the coarser characterizations of his critics in order to cast the innovations of his method and language in a somewhat kindlier light, from the Eastern vantage at least, because, he's Eastern, and in order thereby slightly to allay Orthodox suspicions regarding the fidelity of the Western tradition to its ancient sources. Okay, so this is what's fascinating. So Hart is going to try to help us better see Anselm and better see the Atonement. And then we can ask ourselves is if our view of the Atonement is correct. And if it's too narrow, are we trying to make it too exclusive? It's just only one thing, So then that's what I'm arguing, that I think Gilbert's gospel has become too small. Now, Hart argues for a real continuity between the thought of the fathers and the thought of Anselm, that the Cardeus Homo does not represent a catastrophic breach between the theologies of the East and West, but only a change of accent, and that perhaps the concerns and beliefs that motivate the atonement theories of either tradition emanate to a greater degree than is usually acknowledged from the same story. And that's what's wonderful about this. Hart is arguing that it comes from the same place, the same story. Okay, and what is that story? The story of Christ trampling down death by death. He defeats death by death. Okay, interesting. In the words of the Byzantine Eastern Paschal hymn, and of God acting decisively on our behalf to save us from the powers into which we have delivered ourselves. So if you go back to what Heiser teaches on the divine counsel, and you understand the powers as he teaches, and he has his New Demons book, but he also have the Unseen Realm, which both of you have in Amazon Kindle. So you have that, and you have the book Supernatural. You can understand, but we have delivered ourselves over to them. And to me, that makes a very logical way of understanding Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam or any religion. What have we delivered ourselves over to? And to whom the God we serve? Because Paul said you're either going to be a slave of sin or a slave of righteousness. Okay, they left Egypt as slaves of Pharaoh and became slaves of Yahweh. Okay, so there's no idea in the modern sense of freedom. Okay, there's only the classical freedom view that we are going to be bound to one or the other, but there's no, this freedom that's preached today is totally different than what's understood classically. And again, Hart goes into that in another book. But anyway, Hart acknowledges that misreadings of the Anselm are legion. There are just so many. But many of the misinterpretations to which his work has been subjected over the years are at least instructively false. Okay? In other words, we can learn so much from the dialogue of Anselm on the Atonement. And this is why I wanted to do these videos before we dive into Gilbert. Because I think Gilbert is guilty of the same thing. So I think you're going to see it here in what Hart has to say about Anselm. And Hart is trying to have an ecumenical dialogue here on the Atonement on Anselm. So the argument of Cardeus Homo is easily read as an uncomplicated series of logical steps that lead to a rigidly rational conclusion regarding the juridical necessity of Christ's sacrificial death, an argument that, far from resisting summary, invites it. So we're going to proceed with Hart's rendering of Harnack's summary of Anselm's argument. Before we do that, I wanted to take a moment to help you try to understand. The goal of this is to take someone who's outside looking in, to get a different perspective on the atonement, get a different perspective on the gospel. So here is someone who's trying to be ecumenical. Here's someone who's trying to open up a dialogue, who's trying to, from his tradition, speak to his tradition about their misunderstanding of what the Western Church believes, and then turn around and ask the Western Church to also listen to what the Eastern Church has to say, so that there's a dialogue between the two. And so Harnack is going to offer one of the views that Hart wants to show of how often Anselm is misunderstood in the West, which also the Eastern Church has not read Anselm. So they have read Anselm through the interpretation of Anselm through someone like Harnack. So because Harnack says Anselm says this, you and I from a Western tradition are going to say, oh, that must be what Anselm says. And the Eastern Church, who disagree with Harnack, who disagree with the West, is also going to think, well, that must be what Anselm says. And Hart's argument is neither one has bothered to even look at what Anselm says. And so that's my point. If we're only going to take the gospel from people who think like us, we're never going to learn anything new. We're never going to grow. We're never going to mature. We're going to simply believe one facet, one side, one view, and we're going to miss out on so much more. And so as I argued in the earlier videos, that like Heiser brings up the kaleidoscope view of the atonement, that many scholars talk about. He's not alone. He takes that from others. So there's so many different ways because the gospel, atonement, these things are so big And they do so much that to see them only in one way is to miss out on so many other ways. And so that's why we're here, and that's why I'm excited, and you can see the passion, and I don't feel bad as I did in the first video. So you get more interaction from me here, which means this is going to be a longer video. So Anselm's logic, step 1, according to Harnack, and this is again Hart's summary. Every rational creature is created to partake of beatitude in God, so Anselm asserts, in return for which the creature owes God perfect obedience, by withholding which humanity offends infinitely against the divine honor and merits death. Okay, so this is, we have offended God. We have done something to his honor. Therefore, we deserve to die. And so we owe our perfect obedience to him, as the argument goes. Okay, and because of that, then because we failed, then, that's step 1. Okay, now step 2, inasmuch as humanity has sinned against God to God's dishonor, God's honor then requires that humanity restore what it has taken away, and indeed give still more, in order to make satisfaction for its offense. God is offended, he's angry, and he needs satisfaction. And so, as a person who studies the Old Testament as well, in the Old Testament, if a thief stole $100 from someone, the Old Testament describes that the thief not only gives that $100 back, but also has to give 20% on top. So that's, restitution. So you're restoring what you took, the 100 rupees, but because you caused a problem and because you caused heartache, there's an additional 20%, so you have to give $120 back, is the idea here. So not only, because God is offended, not only must you give back what you've taken, but you must give more. Okay, otherwise humanity must suffer its condign penalty and be handed over to death. So here's the choices. Okay, step 2 of Harnack's view of Anselm. Okay, this is how many read Anselm. Okay, because Harnack read it for us and he told us what it said and we believed him, rather than reading it for ourselves. Okay. Now, step 3, and the funny part about it here is I'm using Hart because you're probably not going to read Anselm. So then I'm using Hart to give you what Harnack said, but also Hart's going to give you a different view so that at least you have different views of Anselm, since you're probably not going to read Anselm yourself. So let's be real. Anyways, third step in the logic. Nor can God merely remit the penalty. It's not like, God can just make it go away, as it would contradict his own righteousness and sovereignty over creation were he to allow sin to pass with impunity. No, there must be an answer for sin. He can't just let it go. Okay, then he's not a holy and just God, right? And thereby raise injustice, sin, to his own level. That means transcendent of any higher law. Okay, God is transcendent. He's outside law. Okay. So God cannot be held accountable to any law because God is above all law, and law comes from God. But if he impugns sin, then sin gets a free pass, but that elevates sin to the same level of God now. And so we can't do that, right? Harnack's saying that can't be possible, so Anselm has to figure this out. So this erases the distinction between good and evil in the latter's favor. Now evil and good are the same thing, and it's actually helping evil if we just allow God. And some forms of Christianity seem to imply this, that God just forgives sin and it's no sweat off his back. But that elevates evil to a position outside of the law and outside of accountability, and in the same, we're elevating evil to the same level as God, is what Harnack is arguing here. Okay. And create division within its own immutable righteous will. Okay, now we're creating division within the will of God. And so through restitution or punishment, satisfaction or damnation, okay, these parallels, restitution or punishment, satisfaction or damnation, humanity shall restore the divine honor and the beauty of the created universe. So again, if you go back to my embodied justice paper, and you see the quote I have from Dennis Knight, I'm trying to argue, what happens when someone sins in the religious sense, or a transgression in the moral sense, and what has to happen, and how shalom is shattered, and how righteousness plays a role, and how justice and all that goes in. And so you have to have this whole process. Well, in this view, Harnack's view, okay, then the only way to deal with this is either restitution or punishment. In other words, someone's restored, or they go to hell, damnation, hell, or God gets satisfied. God has to be satisfied, or humanity has to be destroyed, because this is going to restore the divine honor that's been lost. Okay, this is Harnack's view, and this is the main view behind the Reformed tradition. Okay, so, all right. Now, step 4 in, again, Harnack's logic of Anselm. But humanity possesses nothing by which it might satisfy divine justice. So then that's the next step in the Reformed argument. That since God's honor has been, terribly just destroyed or offended, or whatever language you want to use there, then to satisfy this divine justice, humanity has nothing to give, as it is God himself against whom the gravity of every transgression is measured. And God is so great, so the transgression against God is so great, and what do we have to offer God that can pay back that? It's a debt that cannot be paid. Therefore, the slightest sin is an infinite offense. So there's no white lies here. Every sin is against the honor of God and dishonors God, calling for an infinite and more than infinite restitution. So humanity is left empty. Humanity has no way of paying this debt back. And so it's just too big. It's just too far, gone. In step 5, but it is also contrary to God's goodness, and honor, that his gracious purpose in creation should come to nothing. So otherwise, then we go back with the argument, then why did God create Adam and Eve in the first place? Why did he put the tree in the garden? So it's not like God made a mistake. So then this is contrary to, not only God is offended, God has been dishonored, but this goes against his goodness and honor, and that he should abandon his creature to destruction. It's not that God would do that. God is good, so he has to find a way to save humanity. This is Harnack's next step. Now, Harnack goes on. One is, again, I'm using Hart. He's analyzing Harnack's view. You can read Harnack for yourself, and you can read Anselm for yourself, but I seriously doubt you will. Therefore, I make this video because I can't even probably get you to read Hart's article. So I made this video to make it easier for you. One is called for, then, who can of his own render a payment that surpasses in worth all things unto God. But this is possible for God alone. And yet satisfaction must be made by one of the race of Adam. So here's the logic. God is offended. This thing is so great, but God is so good that he will not leave us, and none of us can do it. But then God is willing to somehow, in the divine logic, he's willing to do this by his goodness, but then it has to be someone from the race of Adam. So here's the logic. You see how the logic flows in the Reformed argument. So God can't do it alone, but only God can do it. Here's the conundrum, the paradox. So, anyway, and so that divine righteousness remains inviolate, the beauty of creation be preserved, and the divine purpose be fulfilled. The God-man must come among his own in order to make satisfaction on humanity's behalf. So this is still part of step 6. So God must become man, the God-man, Jesus. So here it is. So that the divine righteousness cannot be violated. And the beauty of creation still has to be preserved, what God intended, and the divine purpose still must be fulfilled. Therefore, God must become man, the incarnation, in order to make the satisfaction on humanity's behalf. So God can do this as a human. Now, this is a high Chalcedonian Christology. High Chalcedonian Christology is a necessity for understanding how God resolved this apparent impasse between justice and mercy. Okay? So Hart is saying that you must go to your historical theology. You must understanding what happened at Chalcedon and the Christology there that came out of people like Maximus the Confessor. And how did this impasse between justice and mercy, how did it all work out? You have to go there and you have to dig into that to fully understand what Harnack is wrestling with. So that would be a video or 2 or 10 in itself. But anyway, you have to go to understand how the church has dealt with these issues throughout its history and how it has progressed in its discussion of these things and how it's understood these things as a whole, the church. Okay, so we go on to step number 7. Christ as a man owes God his perfect obedience, which he gladly proffers. But as he is a sinless man, he does not owe God his death. Okay, so you begin to see the logic here. When Christ voluntarily surrenders his infinitely precious life for God's honor, and the Father accepts it, the superabundance of its worth calls forth some gracious recompense from God's justice. So you can begin to see how this logic plays out. And because Christ is perfectly obedient as a human, and he gives it, then as a sinless man, though, he does not die according to Romans 5:12. Yet he voluntarily surrenders this life on behalf of God's honor. Therefore, God accepts his sacrifice to restore that honor, and he pays the debt. You see how it works? He pays the debt, and God is satisfied, and his anger is over with. And so the superabundance of its worth of what Christ did on the cross. And again, this is the focus that Gilbert has in what is the gospel. And the Reformed tradition calls forth some gracious recompense from God's justice. Okay? Now, step 8 in the logic is, but Christ, being also God, wants for nothing, of course. And so least God's righteousness be defeated by the injustice of no recompense being given, the benefits of Christ's death passed on to those to whom Christ would bestow them. So Christ makes this sacrifice, and he makes this payment, and he puts it into the account, in the bank account in heaven. But then he doesn't need, so then he's able to take the balance from his account and transfer that balance to someone else and pay off their debt, because he didn't owe anything. He didn't have a debt. This is the logic, okay? Hart goes on to describe Harnack's last step here as God's infinite honor being more than infinitely satisfied. Humanity's debt before God is remitted, and salvation is accomplished in such measure as persons approach God in Christ's name and live righteously. So we incalculated a debt with God. Christ pays our debt, and now we are able to be restored to God, and then we henceforth live a righteous life, and everything is hunky-dory, so to speak. Everything is fine. All right, now Hart is going to get into what Harnack has to say. Those were Harnack's steps, and it's very logical, and I'm sure a Reformed theologian could explain it much better than I, and Hart has done, I think, an admirable job here. But he warns that Anselm's argument, thus denuded of every nuance and ambiguity that enriches the text from which it's drawn, is susceptible of every casual misconstrual the theological mind can devise. So, and this is what he's trying to say, that Harnack has stripped away Anselm's argument down to what Harnack believes of the Atonement, not what Anselm believes. And you're missing so much. Okay, Harnack is wanting you to see what he sees, and therefore you're no longer seeing what Anselm sees. And this is what I'm trying to get at. I'm trying to use Hart to help us have a discussion on the atonement so that we understand the atonement and we understand Anselm, rather than understanding what Harnack wants us to believe of the atonement and wants us to believe that Anselm is saying. It's the same thing when we read the Bible and people tell us this is what the Bible says, and they tell us the Bible says this, and we believe them, not the Bible. And whatever they tell us the Bible says and whatever they tell us atonement is, then we believe them and we don't research it for ourselves. So we're not going to read Anselm ourselves. And so when we actually do read Bible verses, we've been told what they mean, and therefore we automatically believe, yes, that's what the Bible says, without listening to other voices who might say, but have you considered this? Have you considered this? And I give the example of my family here in Nepal. When I first met them, long before marriage or anything, when I first met them, and they would cook chicken. Once a week we would have chicken because we lived out in a remote village, and so we'd cook chicken once a week, and as a special moment, because it was rough out there for a Westerner to eat normal Nepali takari, vegetable curry, and not have some meat. And so once a week we would have chicken. And so when they would go buy the chicken, that was enough because you bought chicken and you cooked chicken. And my counterparts who joined me from India were appalled that they did not want to cook the chicken with onion. Well, no, you don't cook chicken with onion. That doesn't taste good, right? And so, if the father has already bought the chicken, how much more money does he have in his pocket to buy onion? Because obviously chicken is quite expensive, and onion at times can be quite expensive too. And so we went ahead and bought the onion as well and cooked it for them and then had them try it. And they were amazed at how well it tasted, but they'd never tasted chicken with onion before. Okay, so the logic is we were always told that does not taste good, therefore it cannot taste good. But once they had chicken with onion, then they understood, wow, this does taste good. And now every time they cook chicken, they cook it with onion. The same thing here. If we're always told the Bible means this, and we only believe this about the Bible, and we don't listen to anyone else, then we think we only know the only way. And so Hart is trying to say that Harnack has understood the atonement in his way and is basically proof texting Anselm to say Anselm agrees with me. And this is the discussion evolves out of Anselm, but it's a misconstrual, it's a misreading, it's a misunderstanding. Okay, and Hart goes on to say it becomes indeed a theological theory removed from any larger theological narrative. You're missing the whole narrative. Okay, you're missing the whole narrative. And it goes back to Greg Gilbert in that message that you wanted me to listen to when he did that conference for the Gospel Coalition. And he does talk about kingdom language and he does use biblical theology. But then he just goes right back to, but yeah, the gospel means this. And so Matthew Bates was so excited. He's like, wow, he's opening up. He's starting to come out of this single-minded, narrow view of the gospel of atonement, of what God did with Jesus. And he's starting to open up. And then Gilbert comes out and says, no, I'm not. And so Gilbert is basically taking the critique of Matthew Bates and Scot, McKnight and others and has dressed it up a little bit to make it fit the current way that scholarship and the current way that the church is discussing things in what's known today as biblical theology. And yet he's still staying to his same old message. He's just dressing it in a new package. Okay, but it's removed from any larger theological narrative, unable to defend itself by reference to the specific concerns that prompted it or the historical context in which it was situated. Okay, and that's what Gilbert does. What Harnack has done with Anselm, Gilbert is doing with the Bible. And so Hart is trying to open our eyes to see Anselm in a different way, in hopes that open our eyes to see the Bible in a different way, to see atonement differently, because we've stripped it from its historical context. Anselm had something he was saying in his time to his people, right at the split of East and West Church. And the Eastern Church has misunderstood Anselm because he didn't join their side. And the Western Church has misunderstood Anselm because they have gone farther afield from what Anselm actually said. And the same thing is happening with the Bible. We strip it out of its first century Greco-Roman Hellenistic Jewish background, and we make it say what we want it to say, and then all those verses we read, it must mean that. And we're ignoring the larger theological narrative, okay? And we ignore the specific concerns that prompt Paul's writing of these letters, or the historical context in which these letters are situated, and we take Luther's context from 500 years ago instead of Paul's from 2,000 years ago, okay? So this is the danger. So this is why we're going through this, and it's going to take us quite some time. Okay, so Hart encapsulates now Ritschl. Atonement language, one might summarize as an improvement over patristic speculation, insofar as the former depicts redemption as an objective transaction between the Father and Son, rather than as the grossly mythic drama of divine descent and rescue, and insofar as it concerns with the moral rather than the physical reconciliation between humanity and God. And so he's... Again, I'm not presenting his entire article here. I'm just skipping through it, picking out a lot of his comments. But again, is atonement merely this moral dilemma where Christ pays, goose to the Father? Is that all it is? Is he paying God off? Is it graft? It's not grace. So that's the point. We don't want to make the gospel Jesus paying graft to God. It's grace, it's gift, not graft. But this is how the West saw Anselm's language and how they cased it in their own. So for Hart, this view seems to suggest an essential opposition between God's mercy and God's justice. And again, you're going to have to go back to the Chalcedon Christology to understand that these two, and again, I haven't necessarily done as much as I'd like to, but what I have done is studied the prophets. And in studying the prophets of the Old Testament, I have understood the understanding of mercy and justice as one and the same thing. And so you have to get that as well to understand that these two are not in opposition to each other at all. There's no opposition there. The mercy of God and the justice of God are the same thing. Just read the Old Testament prophets who spoke of both as one act, that God's coming, and when God comes, he's going to give justice, and it is merciful, especially to those who surrender to God. If you fight against God, he's still going to be merciful to you, but in ways that you do not understand or do not want to understand. So, anyway, back to Harnack's view. Anselm's language is little more than the logical extension of Western Catholicism's penitential system, and so concerns itself principally with the placation of God's wrath against humanity. Again, he goes back to the whole idea of the West, that God is angry, and so we have to do something with God's anger. Okay? So we have to pay it off. There's a debt. There's a transaction. There's a payoff that must happen. The limits of this system confines this theory to the model of legal transaction enacted between Father and Son, rather than to a model of genuine reconciliation. This is not reconciliation. This is like a business contract. Okay? This is not reconciliation. We're just paying off. Okay, so like the prodigal son comes home and the father goes, and wherever the son did damages, he just pays it off. But the son does not get right with the people who he sinned against. They just get paid. Okay, so we're not made right with the Father ourselves. There's nothing on our part. It's only what Jesus and the Father do. Jesus gives the Father this payment, and the Father is satisfied, and it's between the Father and Son, and we're left out of the whole deal. There's nothing for us. We're not changed. We're still the same as we were to begin with. Okay, nowhere does he show how the opposition of wills between God and humanity is overcome. Okay, nowhere does Harnack show that in his reading of Anselm. Okay, nowhere do we understand this. There's no change in the human heart. Okay, so again, Hart says, he does not commend Anselm for seeing guilt rather than death as that which estranges creation from God, as well as disabusing theology of other primitive elements inherited from patristic thought, such as the notion that Christ's death is a ransom paid to the devil, or the idea of a physical salvation accomplished primarily in the incarnation. The incarnation is totally left out of Gilbert. Again, Jesus could have showed up on Tuesday, died on Friday, case closed. That's it. There's so much. What about what happened physically in Jesus' life? Aren't we supposed to become like Christ and live like he did? Why all this incarnational language? Why all of this thing had to happen? And then we skip it all. Okay? We skip it all. But Harnack, Hart argues, Harnack finds Anselm's theory both unbalanced, limiting the work of atonement to Christ's humanity, and uncomforting, offering no final assurance of justification to the individual who must still strive after righteousness to attain beatitude. And here's what Harnack in the Reformed tradition and the Western tradition often says. We're never going to obey God. So if we're supposed to obey God and we're never going to do it, then we just give up, hopeless. There's no hope because I'm a sinner and I'm always going to be a sinner. But that's the problem. And the Eastern Church wants to argue that participation in Christ causes one to become more like Christ and to sin less, and to sin less, and to sin less. Okay? And to be transformed. You're participating in Christ, becoming like Christ. You begin by imitating Christ, participating in Christ, until you become more and more like Jesus. I often joke with my students, if all you're excited about is watching John Cena videos or Hindi serial videos on your phone than you are about studying or reading God's Word or praying, then when you get to heaven, you're going to be bored if there's no Hindi serials there or whatever. So, because you're going to be still the same, untransformed. And your desires and your passions are for the things of this world. And when you get to heaven, it's going to be nothing like this world and you're going to be bored. Or as some people have argued, it's going to be more of a hell to you than it is heaven. Heaven would be hell because you can't do what you want to do. And that's the problem. Humanity wants to do what it wants to do, and the gospel transforms humanity into becoming like God. People had to enter sacred space in the ancient Near East, had to transform themselves to be able to inhabit the same sacred space as God. So when the priest comes in and the people come to the priest, they had to do certain things in order to inhabit that sacred space to become more like God, until by the time the high priest enters into that most holy place, he becomes so much like God because he's in the presence of God. Okay, that's the idea here. So, and Harnack chides Anselm for failing to enunciate a clear theory of penal suffering, for indeed subverting to such a theory, and for failing to see the necessity not only of Christ's obedience, but of his death. Okay, and that's an argument that a lot of people make, okay, that, it must be the death. They just, go back to the cross again. And there's nothing wrong with the importance of the cross, but if we make it the biggest thing, and I know Paul said, if I can only preach 5 words, I'll preach in Christ and him crucified. But notice it's Christ and him crucified. It's not just him crucified. He doesn't say the cross. If all I get to preach is one thing, I'm going to preach the cross. No, I'm going to preach Christ and him crucified. Okay? So we often overlook that fact. We miss the incarnation. Okay? And so we don't understand what it meant for Christ to obey. Okay? Because if Christ can obey, then he gives us the power to obey by the Holy Spirit. Far from the perspective of Eastern theology, it is more what Ritschl and Harnack find commendable, though, in the Cur Deus Homo, than what they censure that is a source of grief. So, what Hart is saying from an Eastern Orthodox view perspective, and he wants to speak to his people, it's what Harnack and others agree that they say Anselm says, where they find agreement with him, not where they criticize him, but where they find agreement with him that is most scary for the Eastern Church. Okay, So let's go. You might be familiar with the Christus Victor view of the atonement, and Gustav Allen's book here. Wrongful off these understandings or misunderstandings of Anselm paints his cur deus homo as the Latin or Western or Roman Catholic view of the atonement, with Anselm himself serving in consequence as the exemplar of everything decadent and legalistic in medieval Catholic theology. So this is a critique here also that we need to be aware of. Okay, so Hart summarizes, though, this view of Allen's. He dismisses Anselm's project without qualm as a radical break from patristic thought, a narrative of salvation that makes Christ's humanity be the sole agency of atonement, and so stands at odds with the Pauline, the patristic, and genuine Lutheran view of Christ's saving work as a unified divine campaign against sin, death, wrath, and the devil. Again, there's more involved in here, and so there's others who critique Anselm, but they seem to think that Anselm is quite far afield from the fathers, okay, and that he's lost his way somehow. So more criticisms. And he, like Harnack, deplores Anselm's apparent opposition of justice to mercy. He too takes Anselm's language to be little more than monstrous exaggeration of penitential discourse, okay? This penance, that we have to pay penance, okay? Again, it's this payment language that we owe God something, that we have to give God something through penance, okay? Though for him, it is only the rejection of any Anselmian contour of its language of atonement that will allow Western Christianity to recover the correct or classic view of salvation. And this is what Hart is arguing for. We need to recover the correct or the classic view of salvation. And the West has seemingly fallen away from that, according to which redemption is a single continuous divine action, God's descent into the deepest abyss of human estrangement in order to vanquish death, worldly powers, sin, and condemnation, and to raise humanity up to everlasting life. See, the resurrection and the ascension, the fact that Jesus was able to go where he went, and that we are to be like him even as he is, and that where I am, you may also be. What do we do with all these verses in the Bible where Jesus says, you're going to be just like me, that wherever I am, you're going to be? We lose all that. We lose the ascension. We lose the resurrection. We lose the incarnation. We lose all this. We lose the battle. It's no longer a battle over Satan and the powers of darkness. We boiled down the gospel to one thing, a simple transaction where Jesus paid with his life on our behalf at the cross. And we boiled it down to one simple thing and said, this is the gospel. Everything else is extra. This is it. Okay, this is it. And that's a dangerous thing. It's a dangerous thing. And the classic view of salvation, contends Allen, talk of sacrifice is intentionally ambiguous. As Gregory the theologian says, Christ's death is not a ransom paid to the devil, but a sacrifice the Father receives from the Son by economy. For sanctification, and because divine justice requires that Christ alone should overcome the tyrants that hold humanity captive. Okay, so Christ overcomes the powers that hold us captive and sets us free. So we're no longer a servant in their house, their prison, their fields. We no longer work for them, but then we are transferred back to the household of God, and we are a servant in the house of God, but as sons and daughters, as he adopts us. Thus, Christ's sacrifice is an internal relation of the divine will, not an exchange of expiatory death and forensic merit. Okay, and again, it's forensic merit. It's Christ paid for it, and now we merit on behalf of Christ's payment, and it's totally forensic and juridical. Anyway, now Hart wants to discuss where the EO gets it wrong. One enters entirely in the atmosphere of the orthodox suspicion of Anselm, and by extension of all Western theology, in Vladimir Lossky's altogether damning portrait of his theory of atonement. And Hart goes deep into this, and I didn't, but I would encourage you to read the article because I did not do as much on Lasky, partly because we're not from that tradition and I didn't want to get bogged down. And again, as I compiled these notes yesterday, I was extremely sick, so I kind of lost my passion when I got to this section because it doesn't apply to Western thinkers as much, but it is still quite intriguing. Okay, and so you have to understand more of the Eastern Orthodox views and then how they misread Anselm because they think Anselm is saying what Harnack says Anselm says, and they're wrong. And Hart wants to get everybody on the same page and say, you know, what Anselm says is really awesome. So Hart on Lasky, everything that Eastern theologians imagine to be constitutive of Western soteriology, the legalism of its juridical categories, the ruthlessness of the God that it depicts, the mechanical simplicity of its model atonement, Lasky finds exemplary expressed in Cur Deus Homo. Now, for the East, if God's this angry God, then and he has to kill Jesus, and he must punish him. And so I'm you know, we all saw, again, The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson, and we saw the devil back there behind it, and he was like punishing Jesus, you know, and all these things. And it's almost, again, a misconstrual of what Heiser teaches on divine counsel and Job, how the Satan figure in Job 1 and 2, he makes Job suffer because God wants Job to suffer. You know, maybe Mel Gibson, if he was Eastern Orthodox and he wanted to make a parody upon the Western Church, instead of the devil, it'd be God back there pushing, you know, punish him, you know, kill him, do this, you know, do more because, you know, this angry God, you know, come on, you know, as if God is just warning, you know, and you know, at least the Jews would, as Paul has told us many times, would stop at 39 times. You know, you'd only get 39 lashes, where the Romans, they just kept going on and on and on. And so it's like God is just this terrible person. So for the Eastern Church, that breaks their heart because this is not the God of the Bible that they see. Okay. So Lasky takes special offense at the scandal of a book putatively explaining the incarnation, but attempting to do so without reference to the divination, to victory over hell, or the role of the Holy Spirit. And in Anselm's apparent reduction of the resurrection and ascension to a simply happy ending and of salvation to change not in human nature, but only in the divine attitude towards humanity. So Lasky finds Anselm failing. Okay, so he misreads Anselm also, and he sees what Harnack loves. But see, there's so much more in the resurrection and ascension. And again, Lasky is at a loss because for him, Anselm doesn't address. There needs to be a change in human nature. There's no change of humans. If Jesus pays God off, then the humans haven't changed. It didn't cost humanity nothing. It meant nothing to humanity. It meant everything to God, but nothing to humanity. There's no change in the nature of humans in this view, okay? Salvation, so conceived, is little more than a drama enacted between an infinitely offended God and a humanity unable to satisfy the demands of his vindictive wrath. Okay, that's how the Eastern Church sees Anselm and sees Western theology. That God is just this terrible, terrible tyrant. And he's so miffed, and he's so upset, and his honor's been, you know, dishonored. And so much to be preferred is the ambiguity, richness, and narrative complexity of a text like Athanasius on the Incarnation, which allows the story of salvation a greater range of colors, of soteriological models, all narrative in character and all preventing one another from assuming the shape of a single, definitive, and exhaustively rational account of atonement. So again, Hart wants to say, go to Athanasius on the Incarnation, and you'll have a greater understanding here. That's what's missing, okay? Supposedly missing in Anselm. So Anselm can't say everything, obviously. So Athanasius has already said it. So that's the argument here. So the question is, though, on the atonement, have they understood Anselm properly? And now Hart is going to change, and he's going to begin to then describe what he sees in Anselm. And I think what he finds is quite interesting. So this is what others have seen. In the first part of this video is what others have seen and understood of Anselm. And I invite you to read Anselm, and I invite you to read Athanasius, and I invite you also to read Hart, and others. You can read Harnack, and you can read Lusky. So this concludes our second video on the Atonement and Anselm's theories. We hope you enjoyed watching these videos and going through the various views. In the next part, we will continue with Hart's view of Anselm himself. Now that he has completed reviewing the major ways that people have viewed Anselm's atonement theory, he's going to dig into Anselm himself, and from that we can learn to discern ourselves what Anselm had to say and how current views of the atonement have taken Anselm out of context and used him to take their later views of the atonement and apply them. And so Anselm was not an evolutionary step into the church's, per se, current views on the atonement. The current views have misunderstood Anselm and therefore have taken his views as if they were their own. Hart is going to dig deeply into Anselm to try to show how these modern views are not exactly in alignment with Anselm. We hope you continue this discussion with us and watch the third part of the video. Thank you very much.